Hi, good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. A very exciting topic for us, managing the meltdown. We really appreciate you attending with us today. We have a lot to discuss. This is a very hot topic. We know how many families are struggling with this issue with their child either at home or in school or both. And before we get started, I just want to let you know two quick things. This webinar is going to be recorded. It will be sent out to all those who registered or attended, as well as it will be housed on brainbalance.com. So you can look for it there, as well as an email from us. If you have either registered and attended, even if you had to leave early, you're going to get that email. Secondly, if you have a question specific to your family, please type them into the questions box and we'll take as many as we can at the end. I really appreciate you all taking the time, a lot of you on our registration page, to submit questions ahead of time, and I did read them, and we are going to be focusing on a lot of the overlapping questions that many of you had at the end today. Now, I'd like to introduce Rebecca Jackson, who is at Brain Balance, our Vice President of Programs and Outcomes. Rebecca has over 10 years experience helping families at Brain Balance, has so much knowledge into the topic of meltdowns. We're so excited to shed light on why meltdowns happen so that we can help you better understand how to help your child, whether it's before, during, or after in a preventative measure, that dreaded meltdown. So let's get started. Hi, Rebecca. How are you?
Hi. So we've all been there. We've all had that moment when life is sailing along and then it's not. Meet Drew. This is my son. He's now a fifth grader. For any of you who have attended previous webinars of mine, this photo manages to make it into just about every presentation. But the bottom line is all of us, whether we're adults, whether we're 3-year-olds, whether we're teens, we get to that point where we can lose our cool and lose our frustration. And so today we really want to talk through why do we see those behaviors? What are things that we can do to avoid the moment? How can we move things past that? When is too much too much? So what are some red flags that your child's behaviors or concerns, that maybe there's something more and bigger going on, and what can be done about it? So the joys of behavior with kids. And the reality is, again, we all hit that moment. We can talk about, you look at two kids with the exact same scenario. I always give this scenario of, dinner time at the family dinner table, and you spill a glass of milk and parents get frustrated and upset. With one child, you're able to say, hey, go grab a towel, clean it up. You got to pay more attention. The other one, all of a sudden, everything is screaming and crying. And now that moment of what you wanted to be was a nice family dinner has turned into frustration, and dad's mad, and siblings interjecting, saying, telling their other sibling what to do when it's none of their business. So that moment that goes awry. And I think it's so important, forgive my vernacular, because there's meltdowns and tantrums and upsets that happen at every age, and we tend to use different verbs to describe it at different ages. So when we have a 2 or 3-year-old that's having a meltdown or having that moment of upset, we tend to describe it as a tantrum. We typically don't describe a 17-year-old's behavior in that moment as a tantrum. It might be more of shutting down, nasty attitude, slamming the door, stomping away. But the reality is it's the same thing that's happening internally, whether it's a 2-year-old that's hit that point of frustration, meltdown, upset, or an adult. So please know that as we're talking about things, a lot of my language and a lot of the examples are for a child, and I'll try to make that universal because adults have those moments as well, as do our teens and college students. So again, when we look at two kids, two scenarios, why does it sometimes result in a meltdown for one child and not the other? So we're going to try to dig into that and have a more clear understanding. If I can get my screen to advance. There we go. So again, we all have those moments, and so often when we're upset or frustrated, we have to remember that this is actually a form of communication. This isn't a child just being bratty intentionally or on purpose, but there is something real happening inside. So often our child or adult just doesn't have the tools to be able to describe that. Or maybe in a calm, cool, collected environment, they've got the tools, but when they're frustrated and upset, it's harder to access that language, harder to verbalize how you're feeling and why. And so we have to remember that it's a form of communication. It's something that we need to pay attention to. It's an opportunity to learn. And it's also It's always an act towards independence and pushing boundaries. So we have to remember that each healthy stage of development, has challenging behaviors that go along with it as a healthy, normal part of development. So when you look at development from 2 on up, we're always pushing boundaries. We're always wanting to learn how to do things ourselves, our own way, make our own decisions. And so often some of these behaviors are coming from that natural desire to want to push boundaries. We're all going to push things as far as we can take it. And we're looking for that point of, when is that line going to be drawn in the sand of this is okay, this is not okay. So understanding that meltdowns and tantrums are a form of communication. There's something real going on. Whether or not it's something you agree with is relevant. There's real feelings, real emotions, real frustrations, and a scenario that's not working for your child. And it's an opportunity for that child to try to display some independence to push those boundaries. So today what we're going to go over is what is appropriate by age. So again, behaviors happen at every age and stage. Let's get a quick sense of what's an appropriate behavior for different ages. We're going to talk about what's happening in your brain and body when a meltdown occurs to help us understand why, how to handle the meltdown in the moment, things that we can do to avoid it, things that we can do to move through the moment faster, and understanding contributing factors is, if I have a child that's melting down more severe or more frequent or lasting longer than it should, what's going on there and what can I do to make a change or difference in that. And I think it's so important to keep in mind here at Brain Balance, our focus is on development. And we really have a great understanding in knowing that so many of our behaviors, whether it's paying attention in class, cleaning and organizing my room, my behaviors and interactions with my family, all these things that oftentimes we think of as just behaviors are actually a result of our development. When we look at a 2-year-old and a 2-year-old's behavior and interactions, we have very different expectations than that of a 6-year-old or a 10-year-old or an 18-year-old. And part of that stems from the more we are advanced in our development, the better we do with our attention and focus, the better we do expressing our thoughts and feelings and upset, the better we do controlling ourselves when we hit that moment. So when we have a child or a time or a scenario when we feel like, gosh, this behavior is out of control, we're going to look at it through the lens of development. Is there something going on with development that's making these behaviors appear younger than what they should be for this child, or making this more challenging, more difficult to discipline, to motivate, to monitor? So we're not psychologists here at Brain Balance. We do have our third-party professional advisory board. We do have that perspective as well. I'm not here to give advice from that perspective, but we're looking at things from the lens of understanding development and how it impacts these things. And what we know, what research and science has shown us, is when there's gaps and holes in development, if there's pockets of immaturity, we're going to see gaps and holes in behavior. So a child might have more inconsistent behavior from day to day. So they're great one day, you ask them to, clean their room, throw their laundry, pack their bag for school, they do it no problem. The next day you ask them to do the same thing, and it's constant reminders. You're getting pushback, you're getting attitude, and it's so easy to look at it and say, well, you could do it yesterday, so you're fully capable, why can't you do it today? But what we know is if there's any gaps and holes in development, those things are going to be more difficult for that child. So we're going to see more inconsistency in behavior and outcome that goes along with it. And so looking to see if there's any gaps and holes in development that are really going to complicate things and make things harder than what they need to be. So understanding that behavior is a result of development. In fact, even the way we tolerate sensory input, the more mature we are in our development, the better we do with things like sound and texture, with visual stimuli. So again, if you picture a young child and you're going to a festival for the 4th of July and there's loud noises and tons of people going on around, that child is going to be more prone to crying, to melting down, to upsets, versus the older we are, the better we're able to tolerate those things. So if I have a teen or a child that's a little less mature in their development, they're going to tolerate these things less well. So that maturity is going to really play into it. We also, with our development, the more mature and developed we are, the more we develop our ability to inhibit an action. So we all have thoughts that pop in our head. We all have those moments where we want to, reach out and flick somebody or have that moment. But a mature, developed brain inhibits those actions. So the 2-year-old that gets frustrated doesn't have that inhibition. So they're going to lash out. They're going to bite when they're frustrated because they don't have the language to communicate it. But as we develop, the older we are, we shouldn't have a 5-year-old that's biting when they get frustrated and upset. They should have a higher ability to inhibit that, to stop that. So we could have a child that knows right from wrong, and you can say, buddy, is it ever okay to hit your sister? And they can look at you and say, no, I'm not supposed to hit my sister. And I know the result is a timeout. But if they don't have the appropriate development to go along with it, they don't have that break to stop them in the moment when it matters. So being able to memorize something is not the same as being able to apply it in the moment. We need that mature, developed brain for that inhibition. And then keeping it together when we're frustrated. Again, I come home from work, if I'm tired, I'm stressed, the house is a mess, the kids are chaotic, that moment of, am I gonna say, okay guys, let's all pitch in and clean up? Or am I gonna lose my cool and say, are you kidding me? I just cleaned yesterday and here it's a mess again. So all the different factors that go into our ability to modulate and regulate our emotions when we're frustrated impact this. So we're going to talk a little bit further about that. And then also talking about the transition, how to move past the meltdown or upset faster. And what we see is, again, the younger a child is, the less mature in their development, the more they're going to struggle with transitions. And so you're going to see them doing the same thing over and over more. When they melt down, that meltdown is going to tend to last longer. As we mature and develop, we should be able to say, you know what, that's done and over. We're going to set that aside and moving on. And so that struggle with transition, if we've got a meltdown that's carrying on and on and on, and we see that regularly, that's going to be a red flag that there's some immaturity in that development as well. So now let's take a moment to just review, just kind of high overview, a few quick expectations by age, because one of the most frequent questions that we get at Brain Balance is, am I seeing this because it's a 6-year-old boy or because there's something going on with development? And that's always an important question to be able to answer. So we're going to set some just quick guidelines and expectations. So that 2 to 3-year-old, the child is so often trying to strive and push for independence, and those meltdowns can be daily, even a couple times a day, and that's typical and okay in that 2 to 3-year-old age range. Again, they're pushing. They want to put their shoes on themselves even though they don't know how to tie them, and they're going to put them on the wrong feet. They're wanting and striving for that independence. They want to do it themselves even though they don't have the ability to do that, nor do they have the ability to communicate it. So they're going to melt down and get frustrated. Then as we mature to 4 to 5 years of age, we're going to start to develop that concept of right versus wrong. And so if sibling does something, we're going to start to get that sibling tattling of, you're not supposed to do that, which the sibling pieces always escalate, and it's a whole nother nuance of complication on top of some challenging behaviors. So in that 4 to 5-year-old age, we no longer expect the meltdowns to be daily. We do expect them to happen a couple times a week, but again, they should start to become a little bit shorter in duration. We should be getting less of the physical reaction with it. As that child is starting to mature. Then around 6 to 7 years of age, we're going to start to get apologies and starting to begin to develop a little bit more of an awareness of somebody's feelings. And so if we've got a 6-year-old that said something unkind to a friend, after the fact, you should be able to talk to them to say, you know what, how would you feel if somebody said that to you? That really hurt so-and-so's feelings. And so we need to apologize. Again, we're going to see, we should not see physical lashing out and physical behaviors in that 6 to 7-year-old range. So again, we're going to develop that sense of empathy and understanding, starting to recognize when their behavior was wrong and feeling a little bit bad about it, and no longer physical. 8 to 9 years of age is when we really start to get into kind of that a little bit more mature and grown up. And you'll notice this in your own kids is with an 8 or 9-year-old, when they get upset, you're going to see, rather than crying and throwing a fit right there, if they're playing with friends in the neighborhood and they're getting upset, they're going to be a little bit more private. And so they might come in the house to quietly tear up They might remove themselves from the scenario. So the 8 to 9-year-old is becoming more socially aware, more aware of everyone's opinions and what people are noticing. And so they're going to start to become more private with their upset. And it's often difficult at that age to get them to talk about their feelings. And so you can see that they're upset, but it might be really difficult to drag out of them, you know, what happened? How did you feel? So again, if we've got an 8 to 9-year-old that isn't behaving more private with their upset, that's going to be that red flag that we're seeing some development that's a little bit immature. And so if we've got an 8 to 9-year-old that's melting down in the classroom, getting frustrated and upset, that's melting down in front of friends, that's crying and lashing out, that's going to be an example of some immaturity that we're seeing. 10 to 11 years of age, we should be pretty good at controlling our anger. That doesn't mean that we're not going to get a snippy response or we're not going to stomp away and slam a door. But again, it's going to be that you know, it's building and building and building, and I'm holding it in, and I'm going to move away from the scenario when I'm upset, and I'm going to want to be by myself. I'm going to want to communicate to you that I'm mad, so there might be that stomping of the feet. We're going to get, this is my son that was melting down at the first slide. This was Drew pouting and being mad about something last summer, so he's probably 9 in that picture. So again, he's able to control that anger, and he's going to let us know that he's mad, but it's not going to result in that full meltdown or upset. Then as we get into those upper years, we get hormones coming in, and those hormones kick in at different ages for kids, and we say that's a game changer, where again, we're just going to get more in the way of ups and downs with good days and bad days. So that brings in a whole new level of complication. As we get a little bit older, 14, 15 years of age, we're going to see the kids are really more about their friendships. So they're less about family time and more about prioritizing time with friends. And again, in those upper years, instead of those tantrums, instead of the lashing out, we're going to get shut down. So we're going to get time spent more shut away in our room with the door closed, not wanting to talk about things, not wanting to engage in things. So again, those meltdowns can look different. But again, if I've got a 14 or 15-year-old that it is, you know, loud and lashing out and physical, again, that's going to be a sign that that's not appropriate for that age. And so a red flag that there might be something a little bit more going on there. So again, what we should see in development is year after year, the meltdowns, the shutdown, the tantrum, whatever you want to call it, should become less frequent. It should become less intense and shorter in duration. It should become less physical and more controlled and more private. So that means if you're not seeing things trend that way, again, when we look for those red flags, not trending into that shorter, less frequent, less intense, less physical is a concern. So when we talk about why do meltdowns happen, again, I'm not a psychologist, but we need to understand that this is a symptom. It's a form of communication, and there's a clear message being shared. So when you look at the young child, so let's say we're in a really, you know, maybe it's at a birthday party and there's a lot of chaos going on, and kids are, you know, maybe it's that bounce house birthday party, and so there's the loud air compressors and, you know, kids running around and music playing in the background, and we've got a child that should be having fun, but instead of having fun, they're clinging to you and they're not wanting to engage. That might be a sign that they're just overwhelmed, that there's too much sensory pieces going on. It might be that they've just gotten too overstimulated, and so they're needing to kind of self-regulate. They're needing calm, quiet. They're needing to remove themselves from the environment. It might be that they're uncomfortable. Maybe their feelings got hurt. Maybe they got scared by something and they don't have the language to communicate it to you, or they're trying to capture your attention. We've all had those hangry moments in ourselves or in our kids where, again, if we've gone too long without protein, we can see an escalation of those behaviors, and we're going to talk about that more a little bit. But the bottom line is when a meltdown and upset is happening, it's a form of communication. There's something going on that your child doesn't have the ability in that moment to communicate with you in an appropriate way, so it's coming out in another format. So what happens is we all have upsets, we all have frustrations, but when it tips into that out of control mode, that's our brain and body shifting from our everyday functioning where we've got the ability to think, to reason, to shifting into an out of control or a fight or flight response. you know, a great way to understand this is we should spend the vast majority of our lives in that relaxed, calm, focused state. So again, I can listen, I can pay attention, I can think about how you're feeling, versus when you're in that fight or flight mode. If you think about, you know, a time when you got into a really heated argument with your spouse, or you got really mad at your kids, or really upset about something, those are those moments when things come out of our mouths that we wouldn't normally say. So in that moment, you're not reasonable, you're not thinking things through, you're not planning ahead. It's literally a fight or flight. You're just simply lashing out. It's almost animalistic in behavior, where brain is gone from being able to think ahead and plan ahead to just being in the moment. So if you think of, you know, if you cornered a wild animal, it's that fight or flight mode of they're just going to try to run and get away. It's not that calm planning piece. And so when we hit that meltdown mode, we've gone from calm and reasonable into out of control. And things can build and escalate until that point of no return. Once we tip the scales from that relaxed calm into fight or flight, we're now, brain's in a different mode, and it takes a little while to recover from that. So once we trip into that fight or flight, our survival mechanisms are going to kick in. And so there's less blood and energy in the parts of our body that are digesting food, that keep us calm and relaxed, that allow us to go to sleep. We're in that survival mode. So a couple things that are going to happen. We're going to get pupil dilation, our heart rate's going to increase, our breathing's going to increase, our body's going to release stress hormones, and the blood and energy in the body go to the extremities. So picture, you know, back in caveman days in evolution, this was a survival mechanism. And so if you're trapped in a dangerous situation, your pupils are going to dilate to let in more light so you can see really clearly. And your body's gearing up to fight for survival or run to flee to get away. So body really is in literally that fight or flight mode. I love this quote. The book is Help for Billy. It's a really interesting, good book. And the book is about, it talks a lot about trauma and how trauma has an impact on development and behavior. And what's interesting is in this book, I see so many parallels between the behaviors we see with and concerns we see with immature development are very similar to what you can see with trauma. So two separate reasons, but it often plays out very, very similar. So the quote is, when a child's in survival mode, the top-down control of the brain fails. So that ability to inhibit, to think things through, to rationalize, that part of the brain fails, and the limbic system becomes more powerful guiding behavior than the neocortex. At this point, it's not about morals, personality, or choice. It's a level of instinct, emotionality, and survival. So again, it becomes more emotional and less rational, reasonable. So during the moment, the child is going to be functioning in the moment. The brain, when we're in fight or flight mode, is not able to think ahead. And so the brain's thinking in these just few second increments. It's in survival mode, and yet that emotional part of the brain is activated, which is why we're getting the shouting, the crying, the melting down. And what's interesting is our knee-jerk reaction as a parent is to start, you know, coming up with rewards or punishments, right? So the child, you see this meltdown starting to happen, and we say, you know, buddy, if you're going to hit your sister, if you're going to lash out, if you're going to melt down, we're going to do timeout. Rationalizing with the child in this moment is not ever going to be productive or effective, because they're not in that moment to be able to take it in and think about it and apply it. So this is not the time to have a discussion. This is not the time for reward or punishment. We simply need to get the child or teen through this moment. And then after the fact, once body has reset back to calm, that's when you've got an opportunity to discuss and plan. So you really have to understand that once that meltdown moment happens, and again, adult example, right? Think of that frustration, you and your spouse, you and your significant other, you and, you know, a coworker. You get to that point where you're so frustrated. Sometimes the best thing to do is to walk away and say, you know what, I need a few minutes. You need time for that body to reset so you can come back and be logical. We should do the same thing with our kids and model that for our kids as well, is rather than shouting at our kids when we're frustrated and upset, let them know, you know what, I'm getting to that point. We need to take a few minutes and then we can regroup and discuss. So once we trigger into fight or flight, In a healthy, mature system, it's going to take about 20 minutes to reset, 20 minutes for your system to calm back down, for blood pressure to drop, breathing and heart rate to slow down, to get back into that reasoning, logical part of the brain that can plan ahead and think. Now, that's a healthy, mature system. If we have a child that's young or a child that's immature in aspects of development, it's going to take longer to reset. So remember when we talked about how when meltdowns or upsets are taking longer than what they should, lasting too long, it's going back to an immature system is going to take longer to reset, to calm. So again, the more immature the development, the longer it's going to take to transition past that fight or flight mode. So what do we do during that moment? So when fight or flight is triggered, we want to stay really calm. And this is so hard because our knee-jerk reaction is when we get upset, we get louder, we get bigger, we get more aggressive. And we've got to think about what's going to trip and trigger fight or flight. Fear is going to trigger fight or flight, and it's not going to help us reset. And so rather than coming over in our behaviors and our reactions, we really want to ideally come under. And that's so hard to do because as soon as, if a child starts to melt down and they're getting louder, our tendency is to come over them. So I'm going to talk even louder. I'm going to get in their face. I'm going to, my pitch might become more shrill. And in fact, we actually want to do the exact opposite. So when you think of your tone of voice, we want to be calm. Buddy, I know you're frustrated right now. We can't do this. And so coming under them, not over them. We want to be just relaxed and neutral in our facial expressions. Again, we want slow, low, calm. Again, when we're in fight or flight, the brain isn't processing things the same. And so if I say, but if you melt down right now, there's going to be, a timeout and we're not going to get to go do that play date later, that young immature brain isn't going to be able to process all of that information. And so I'm going to just say, not now. The less we say, giving space in between, the more they're going to be able to take in. Gentle touch is also a really powerful thing. There's some really interesting studies showing the power of human touch. So just something as simple as a gentle touch on the shoulder. If it's a smaller child, it's something that's really out of control, physically holding them so that, again, the young one where you're able to just hold them on your lap and just hug them and hold them. That deep touch, that loving, gentle touch can be very soothing and calming. I know that's easier said than done. When we've got a child, if we've got a 10-year-old that's melting down and upset in that moment of destroying their room, we want to keep them safe. We want to keep the people around them safe. So if at all possible, just that touch can be very powerful. I get there's times when that just isn't a reality. And so there are times where sometimes we just need to let things play out. But in the meantime, know if you're yelling and shouting on top of that, that's probably going to play into this stretching out longer rather than getting through the moment faster. So some simple things is, if you see that your child is starting to escalate, turning the light down low, not dark, we don't want to scare them, but turning lights down, turning off any extra distractions or background noise if you're in a space where you can control that. Turn off the TV, turn off the radio, get siblings out of the way. We get sibling questions all the time of, if siblings love to push each other's buttons, right? And so being able, the sibling, interjecting, saying he did this or he didn't do that, or just really the fewer distractions, the fewer voices we have involved, the better. And so being able to say, not now, right now I need you to leave the room, we're going to talk about this later, is right now we've got to get the child that's in fight or flight, that student that's in fight or flight through that moment, and then we can regroup and talk about things afterwards. So again, remember, this is a form of communication, so pay attention. And so again, if you're in an environment, you're at the mall and you feel like it's happening out of the blue, stop and think through what happened before that. Were there things that were escalating and leading up to that? Sometimes with a younger one, you can watch where maybe they start to get clammy, they start to get agitated, maybe they start to get really wound up and hyper, maybe their cheeks start to get red and splotchy. Pay attention to what's happening around so that you've got an understanding of what is it that's too much for that student or child that's tripping or triggering this. And then acknowledge that how they're feeling is real. If I were to stub my toe and say, oh my gosh, this hurts, and my husband said to me, you're fine, that doesn't hurt, That's going to make me mad. You don't know how I feel. I know how I feel. And so acknowledging to the kids, and we're, today's society, we're in such a, it's okay to talk about our feelings. It's not this shove it down. It's okay to get upset. It's okay to have hurt feelings and to get mad. And so to acknowledge that, I get that you're upset, buddy. What's not okay is how you're handling things right now. And again, we'll talk about that, but in the moment isn't the time to do that. But my recommendation is to acknowledge the feeling. It is real to them, whether or not you agree with it. And paying attention to, again, their communication and what they're saying. Another piece that I think is so important is to understand, if we're watching, there's times when these things are escalating and building. Maybe you're sitting with your fifth grader and you're working on math homework and you feel like they're not paying attention and they're starting to slam their pencil down and say, I'm stupid, I can't do this, this is too hard. If we're watching, there's clues watching this build and escalate. And then so often as parents, we can be the tipping point. We can be the point that puts it over the edge and now we're in fight or flight, or we can be that point that helps to de-escalate things. So again, what's knee-jerk easy to have happen as parents is you're sitting there working on homework, your child's not paying attention, they're not even trying. It's so easy to get mad and say, darn it, you're not paying attention, I'm taking time out to help you and you're not even trying. That shouting for a lot of kids can trigger that fight or flight. And so if they're already teetering on that edge, we need to de-escalate, not push the scales. So if you see it building, we want to, again, lower our voice. We want to go calm, soothing, gentle, quiet. So again, homework time, lots of distractions happening. Get other kids out of the room. Turn off noise and background noise. Calm, quiet environment. We're talking a little bit about the importance of muscles. Using our large muscle groups and spiking heart rate is one of the simplest, most powerful tools we have at our disposal. And to me, it's so important that we teach our kids these as lifelong tools. And so if we realize that if I take a minute or a couple minutes to, do some burpees or go for a run before I sit down and do my homework, that I'm going to have more control over how I feel and my behaviors. That's a lifelong healthy coping strategy and mechanism where we want to teach our kids that in a positive way, not in a negative punishment way for behavior. So again, we'll talk a little bit more about things that you can do, but just, I'm not trying to place the blame on parents. I watch it happen over and over in my own household and others. We can be that tipping point that's pushing things over the scales or helping to de-escalate. So being aware of how that can happen. So again, we've talked about how the less mature you are in development, the less of an ability you have for impulse control, to self-regulate, to know when you need some time to regroup. And so the less mature you are, the more we've got to be aware of all these other things that go into it. So questions to ask yourself to help avoid the meltdown is, did they have a rough day at school? When you pick them up from school or they got dropped off, if they come in a surly mood, that can be a clue right there of, okay, oh boy, I need to really watch things tonight. Maybe this is when we set everything aside and we go for a bike ride before we do homework or ask to do chores. Major transitions, again, the less mature we are, the less well we do with handling transitions. And so was there a sub at school today? Did somebody different pick the child up after school? Was there a change or something different that they didn't know was happening that could be very stressful for that child? Watching to see that energy escalating and increasing, the level of chaos in the environment. And again, if we're asking them to do something that's difficult for them, even if it shouldn't be, if we've got areas of immaturity and development, there can be tasks that should be okay for that age that are harder. And talking about your feelings or your day is a perfect example of this. Obviously, I'm a talker. I can talk a lot. I can talk fast. So for me, that doesn't take a lot of energy. But we have to remember there's parts of our brain that form the thought and parts of our brain that get it out. And we need all these parts of the brain syncing and working together to do that successfully. If I have a child who struggles in any one of those areas of development, it's going to take more energy and effort to get something out. So when I'm saying, hey, Drew, how was your day? Tell me all about school today. I'm assuming that Drew can talk about his day the same way I can, and that may or may not be the case. And so understanding that it might take more energy and effort and work for your child to do something that you're asking them to do is important. Watching that sweaty clammy is another piece. And as we're talking about these things, when I look at easy things to do as a parent is we look at the child's age, not their development, to set expectations. And so we can look at them and say, you know what, you're 10, you're in 4th grade, fourth graders should be able to do this. Come on, you're acting like a 2-year-old right now. Really, we should be setting our expectations off of their development, not off of their age, because the two don't always line up. And so if I've got a 10-year-old that's developmentally 6, I'm not going to ask a 6-year-old to sit for 2 hours and finish their homework. I'm going to ask a 6-year-old to sit for 20 minutes and I'm going to sit there with them. A 6-year-old is going to require redirection when you say, hey, go up, brush your teeth, put your pajamas on, get ready for bed. I'm going to need to reinforce that. Hey, did you brush your teeth? Did you hang up your wet towel? With a 10-year-old, you shouldn't have to reinforce those things. But if you're having to say those things over and over, if there's more hands-on needed, we've got to remember that their development might not line up with their body age. And so we may need to shift and change our expectations of that child until development is where it should be. And I think expectations are so important in setting everybody up for success. Other things that go into our ability to self-regulate: sleep. Again, think of yourself. If you are exhausted, the kids are going to set you off more easily. And so has your child had enough sleep? Protein. We've all had that hangry moment. My daughter is a classic example of this. Is if she's gone too long without protein, she'll get really whiny, really irritable, much more weepy. As soon as we plug protein into her, within 20 minutes, she's back to her sweet, easygoing self. And so often when we look at quick, easy ways to eat in our kids that are super picky eaters, we're not always great about getting kids protein consistently throughout the day. We do that bowl of cereal in the morning that's full of carbs and sugar. They might be doing, pasta for lunch and a piece of spaghetti or a piece of pizza for dinner. But making sure that we're consistently getting protein and good healthy fats in throughout the day is going to help to regulate those behaviors, so we're getting less of those peaks and valleys. Physical activity. When we use our large muscle groups and we're spiking heart rate and recovering, it's engaging lots of parts of our brain and body that help us to regulate. And so we're going to be more able to control our frustrations and upset if we've done something physical. So if we have a child, and this is such a classic example, if we've got a child that comes home from school and we let them veg out on a couple hours of video games, when we turn that video game off, we're going to get negative pushback, nasty behaviors. We've had a child do tons of stimulation. So video games are not all bad. There's some great things to them in smaller doses. But if we've done 2 hours of that, they're processing so much information and they're not engaging their body. They are going to be in a negative mode. And it's not just that they don't want to stop. When we want to engage the positive parts of our body that can do emotional regulation, that can control, it's engaging our muscles. And so we want a well-rested brain that's not tapped out and fatigued, and we want physical activity, and that's going to set us up for more positive behavior and a better ability to control those things. Okay, so when we're in the moment of we've got the tears and the crying and the melting down, or the slamming doors and storming away, or whatever it is in your household, what are the most effective strategies to get through the moment and to calm and reset the system faster? Deep breathing. Oxygen is one of the best things that you can do, which is why this goes back to physical in so many ways. Meditation, yoga, all of those, mindfulness, are all really great things. And so much of what's really great about it is that deep breathing. When we start to get tense and stressed and frustrated, our shoulders tend to start to come up, our breathing starts to become really shallow rather than those deep, healthy breaths. So slow, deep breathing. And again, this is a great thing to model in your own household, of when you feel yourself getting to that point of escalation, is stopping and saying, you know what, I'm so frustrated and angry right now. I'm going to take a minute to just breathe, and then let's talk about it. Model these things in your own household that you want to see in your kids' behavior. That gentle touch, again, like I said, great studies showing just a simple loving touch. So, just being there and present with them is just, having a hand on, holding their hand or hand on their shoulder, or just physically being with them in just a calm, consistent, loving way. And physical exercise. So again, when we engage large groups of the body, it wakes up huge portions of our brain. So engaging areas of the brain that give us positive feelings and emotions, that allow us to regulate how our responses a little bit better. And as we're physical, it's also increasing oxygenation. So, something simple. So let's say you've got, again, a 10-year-old melting down, frustrated, upset. Once they're done with the actual, like bawling, lashing out, just saying, hey, why don't you go take a few minutes, go jump on the trampoline. Some quiet time away from the chaos where they're using their muscles, their breathing is going to allow that system to reset. It's a great strategy too for when you see things starting to escalate, is again, remove them from the chaos and figure out a way to use those muscles and that deep breathing. We get the question often, how do you handle these things in school? And that's tough, right? Because you've got to have a teacher that, we've got teachers that are amazing with these things. We've got teachers that are set in their ways for how they handle things or feel like certain approaches don't work in their classroom. It depends on the child. There's so many different nuances that can go into this. But if there's a school scenario or option to be able to put some physical in, that can help. So again, if you know a time of day when the meltdown tends to happen, is to watch the chaos and transitions happening right before it and trying to put in something physical. And so even if it's something as simple as go in the hallway and jump 100 times, or go do squats or lunges down the hallway, or jumping jacks, it doesn't need to be anything fancy or high tech, but doing something to use and engage the large muscle groups and increase the breathing can be a really calming thing for the system. I think it's also really important to keep in mind the pushback is, especially, human nature, we're going to push boundaries and see what we can get away with. And when we get frustrated and upset, then our knee-jerk reaction so often is no. And so trying to not give a child or student something to push against. And so rather than just flat out saying no, or, we had a scenario the other day in the center, a child that has been doing amazing, but just in the last couple of weeks, every time it's coming time for a writing exercise, there's meltdown and upset happening in the classroom. And when we started problem solving this and thinking this through, finally what the child said to us is he couldn't think of a prompt to write down. And so because he couldn't think of anything, he was getting frustrated and upset, and then it was resulting in behaviors. And the teacher was coming at it saying, you have to write, you have to do something. And he had said to the teacher, I can't think of anything. And she's like, I don't care, just write something down. So we came up with a strategy of, have a list prepared of a couple things that you could write about. So talking about it the night before. So getting the teacher involved to say, hey, tomorrow we're going to write about animals. And so he's got some time to think ahead a little bit, to plan ahead. So he's got a plan going into that moment. So what was happening is the teacher was saying, you've got to write. And he was saying no and shutting down. Now, again, he was shutting down because he couldn't come up with something to do. And so when we helped him to figure out a strategy, that helped that moment. I hope that example made sense. So then after the meltdown, that's the time to talk about, again, we didn't talk to this child in the middle of the meltdown about why he was melting down at class. We talked to him about it that night while he was in center. You've gotten frustrated and upset this week in school. What happened? And he was able to verbalize and tell us what happened and why he was upset after the fact. And again, we learned from it. We looked at the example in the scenario to say, okay, how can we get it so he's not pushing back against the teacher? What can we problem solve here so he can feel good about it? Because his handwriting's doing better, his writing's doing better. He was just simply still struggling with how to come up with an idea. And again, guilty in my own household. I've got a 10-year-old and a 12-year-old. My 12-year-old daughter the other day was being super sassy, and I caught myself when I was correcting her, I was using that same sassy tone. And so guess who she learned that crappy tone from? She got it from me. And so being aware of how I behave, I'm doing some additional schoolwork right now too, and I've found myself stressed and edgy when I'm trying to concentrate, and the kids, and I've got deadlines saying, guys, I'm trying to do homework, and I'm catching myself. I'm teaching them, this is what it looks like to behave when you do homework. And so making sure that we're modeling for our kids what we want to see in them. And so telling them, you know what, I've got a lot that I've got to get done today. So I want a kind of a calm, quiet environment, and let me work on this. And then later we can go do it. So trying to show them, you know, instead of being stressed, I'm going to create a plan and this is how I'm going to deliver on it, being aware of my own tone. So that way we're mirroring what we want to see in our own kids. I also love the role play of, you know, again, those, you know, second, third, fourth grade years of, you know, we behave and we don't always hear our own words or our own tone. And so playing it back and giving them example, again, not in the moment during the upset, but after the fact of, you know, mirroring, this is what you sounded like, you know, here's, let's role play. Is this an okay way to say it, or is this an okay way to say it? And you can make it silly and fun and a learning experience. But again, it's after the fact when that discussion and learning happens, not during. Sorry, there's so much to cover on this topic. So again, occasional upsets and meltdowns are typical for all of us. It all happens. We all hit that threshold, that point of no return. The question is, are they age appropriate? Are they lasting too long? Are they too frequent? Are they trending in the right direction? And if not, we really want to take a look at that development to see, is development not lining up with body age? Because there's things that we can do to drive that forward and move that forward. I always think of things in terms of a cliff. We all have that cliff. We all have that moment where we're going to lose our quote, where we're going to become symptomatic. The question is, are we standing right up against that cliff, or are we standing 2 miles away from that cliff? There's things that we can do where we have, you know, if I start here, but then I've eaten a ton of sugar, that's going to peak and crash my attention and focus and behaviors. And I haven't had much protein and good fat that helps to stabilize that. And I'm in a super chaotic environment, and I've got pockets of immaturity with my development. Then I've got much less of a threshold to tolerate the frustrations and upsets of life. So I'm going to trigger into that meltdown or upset so much more frequently. So we always want to make sure that development is right in line with where it should be for age to create a big buffer. Then we want to make sure good sleep, healthy nutrition on top of that, you know, calm environment, so that we're creating a bigger buffer. So that way when the upsets happen, they're less frequent and more in control. So again, we do consider it a red flag if those upsets, meltdowns, behaviors are not lining up with expectations for age. So again, what we see is if there's gaps and holes in development, we're able to mature areas of the brain. Our senses and our muscles are two of the biggest drivers and stimulators of the brain. And so doing really specific particular exercises can target different areas of the brain to mature those functions so that we have more of an ability to communicate what's going on and how we feel. Higher development is giving us that inhibition. So when I feel like stomping my feet and slamming the door and throwing a fit and raising my voice, I've got an ability to hold that in and be age appropriate in my reactions and behaviors. And that's what we do and focus on at Brain Balance, is really driving things forward as well as possible. And so making sure all aspects of development are maximized so that we're able to be successful in a classroom experience, having a conversation with a friend. You know, when we think of anything that we do in real life, you know, think of a conversation happening at a dinner table. You've got to be able to pay attention, to process what you see visually, to process what you're hearing. You've got to block out distractions and remember what's being said. And that's just in a simple family conversation. So to be successful in that, you need all these things working together at the same time for you to participate in an age-appropriate fashion with that. If you've got complications in any just one of those areas, it can make something as simple as a family interaction more difficult than what it should be, or paying attention in a classroom, or handling a frustration or upset with friends. And so at Brain Balance, we want to make sure that all of these separate functions are working together and doing exactly what they're supposed to do, so that your focus gets to be on listening to what your friend's saying or paying attention in the classroom, rather than trying to work so hard to keep up and follow along. So at Brain Balance, we do work with kids as young as 4. We work all the way through college age. And really, again, we work to maximize function so that we can be more successful in any environment.
Awesome. Thank you, Rebecca. I'm going to go over some information on this slide, and then we're going to take everyone's questions. We received your questions, and we do have a few minutes left. So let me get through this really quickly for you all. We really appreciate you attending in real time with us today, meaning logging on and listening with us. As a thank you for attending, we'll be sending you a link to download our Essential Oils and Tips for Calming Children guide. It's a guide for parents that we put together to give families helpful tips to support your child in staying calm and focused at home. It's really filled with these tips for staying calm and focused, as well as a guide to using essential oils as one of those tips for staying calm at home. So hoping you guys can use this to add some essential oils into your routine. You can look for an email from us with a link to the download, and as well as the webinar recording. If you go to the next slide, Rebecca. Awesome. Okay, so we really invite you guys to stay connected with us. You can follow us on Facebook. Look for your local center on Facebook. Follow our national page. You can follow us on Instagram. Please follow Rebecca Jackson at Dr. Rebecca Jackson on Instagram. And as well, we just wanted to point out that you can go to brainbalance.com and look through our past subjects of webinars if you found this information useful. What's great about GoToWebinar is that you can download the app on your phone. You can listen on the go, in the car, when you're working out, etc. And we have been doing these webinars for officially 1 year, consistently every month. So we have about 12 for you guys to listen to on past topics, very similar to this, things that are going on with children that may be related to meltdowns. So with that being said, what we're going to do is we're going to get into questions. I have a great question here, Rebecca, to start. Can you address when a teen still has meltdowns? What piece do we think is missing once they get into teenage years?
Yeah, so, our ability to control ourselves when frustrated, upset, those meltdowns, it comes from higher level development. And so it comes back to executive function, frontal lobe pieces is, again, how do we handle ourselves when we're frustrated and upset? And we typically don't see these things happening in isolation. And so if you're seeing a struggle with one aspect of executive function, there may also be other pieces. So there might be a struggle with organization, prioritizing. If we see a struggle with executive function pieces, it's often also a body that has a harder time handling stress, worries, anxiety. And so it's a system that tends to trigger into fight or flight or stress more easily. And so that it results in these upsets or meltdowns. And so again, and looking at that age, it's really going to come down to higher level brain functions of executive function, but we can't expect those high level brain functions to come together if there's any gaps and holes down below it. And so we're always looking at that chain of events of development to see, how did everything come together? What's that first point of complication that's derailing things or making things harder than what they should be?
Thank you. This question is from Michelle. Should we be alarmed if the behavioral expectations are not being met at home, but are fine in public? We get this question so often. I'm excited to read it to you.
Yeah, there's some really important nuances there. That's a great question. Is when a child is developed enough to be aware of what they should do, that's a good sign. So that tells me that they're aware, they're not going to behave that way in front of friends, in front of other people. So they know what good looks like and they can hold it together just well enough to not do that in front of others. And so a child that has larger developmental concerns isn't going to be aware of what others think and less of aware of an ability to control that. So we're going to get those behaviors in all environment. So there can still be lack of maturity and development. It's just oftentimes not quite as severe. And so then what happens is we're in that safe place at home and I've worked so hard to hold it together all day long. And then I get home and I just lose it. I had a student, this was years ago, and I'll never forget this, just awesome kid, high school, doing the assessment. He asked to go to the bathroom so many times. And finally, after like the fourth time, I said, hey, is everything okay? Is something going on? And he said to me, this was a student that had some tics and twitches, and so he would try so hard to control that, and there were times when it just needed to come out. So he would go into the bathroom and just let it all out, and then come back and try to hold it together in front of me. And I know this is a different example, but my point being, he could control it. He was aware that it made him look different. He probably got teased by kids, and so he did everything he could to control it, but that drained so much energy for him that he needed to let that off. And so we see that with behaviors too, is an awareness of what it should look like, but having to work harder to hold it together, and so then we can really see it fall apart at home.
Awesome, thank you. Next question, why is my 13-year-old daughter melting down and arguing whenever I say no?
13-year-old daughter. And again, that's where, to me, that brain balance assessment is always so informative, because without knowing more information, it's hard to know, is this hormones, is this 13, is this middle school, or is there something more going on? Things are harder for her than what it should be, so you're getting more pushback. When we look at our assessment, it's all of these age and grade based functions to say, okay, she's 13, but in these categories, she's functioning, ahead of age appropriate, or like an 8-year-old, or like a 10-year-old, to show, where are things potentially derailing. So without knowing more, it's really hard to know and say. What I can say is, look to see, again, these things don't happen in isolation. So if it's related to development, it's not going to be just behavior. It might be that she needs to reread the same paragraph a few times to get information to stick. She might be less independent on getting through homework and homework time. She might have more of a tendency to get into upsets or frustrations with friends. The combination of things is different with every child. But when it comes down to development, when you look at a nerve in the brain, each nerve connects with up to 1,000 other nerves. So if we have one part of the brain not doing its job at age appropriate, it's going to impact the things around it. And so that's where we start to get this list. A child that has the label of ADHD also often has other labels that go along with it. It's because of how development and communication connections in the brain work.
Okay, we're going to do one last question. I tried to piece together a bunch of questions on the same topic, and it's really interesting to me that we have so many parents asking this, but how can I help my child out of fight or flight mode if they're in that situation, if he refuses to do deep breathing? So what would be maybe an alternative with the pieces that you mentioned to help de-escalate?
Honestly, time is the biggest thing. Is you just have to give it time. Even in a perfectly healthy system, it takes 20 minutes to reset. So again, if you think of a time when, you've gotten really frustrated, upset, your blood pressure's high, your cheeks are flushed, you're really worked up, it takes a healthy system 20 minutes. Then if we've got any immaturity, it's going to take even longer. So, you can do chewing gum, eating food. Chewing it triggers the system that helps with digestive enzymes and digestion to kick in. That's a minor piece. I don't want to start creating habits of we eat food when we're upset. So, being careful with that. But the reality is, some of this there's no magic silver bullet for. It just takes the body time to reset. But again, calm, quiet environment. Yelling, threatening, now is not the time for a punishment or reward. It's literally getting through that time and moment and then addressing when things calm down.
Awesome. Rebecca, thank you so much. Again, you guys can follow Rebecca at Dr. Rebecca Jackson on Instagram. You can follow us on Facebook. Please visit our website, brainbalance.com, to read more about brain balance and the science behind meltdowns that we talked about today. You can also view this recording online in the next few days, or you're going to receive an email that has the recording. We're so thankful that you joined with us today, and we hope you have a great day. We'll talk to you soon.
Great, thank you.
Bye.